struck me during the Karina's presentation that legal rights and protections are really at the core of a number of issues. We heard about issue of childcare center regulation, employment rights, the whole issue with contract for service, discriminatory employment practices, and so on. One particular area where legal rights may be important could possibly be wage protection. A number of AWARE's recommendations have got to do, for example, the CPF top-up, as well as the expansion of WIS, have got to do with public resources subsidizing people's pay. So some might say that employers should be the ones to pay fairly, not the state, which suggests some kind of wage standards, possibly a minimum wage. Perhaps I could put this to Karina, what do you think, and as well as others too?
I think it's minimum wage is actually quite important because many employers as businesses will try their best to survive, make as much money as possible, and if there isn't a protection for workers, then there will be people who will be taken advantage of in terms of wage. So minimum wage, minimum conditions of work should definitely be legislated. They should not just be, I know the government likes to be business light, or they don't want to have too many regulations on businesses. So a lot of things are in the form of standards and practices which are introduced by TAFEP, but which are not enforceable. And I think that we actually have to move towards legislation. So currently, government is using the progressive wage model as the answer to minimum wage. I think this is a good step, but I'm not sure how feasible it is, and maybe you do need a default because they just do it in terms of each industry, and they have a fairly elaborate scheme. Some of this is brings in a lot of training, and I think that one of the problems with the progressive wage model is we haven't done enough analysis on can women who have a lot of childcare and family responsibilities actually find the time and enough support to attend training so that they can get higher wages? Or does that perpetuate the current situation, which is that you're stuck in a low wage job because you can't actually do the training, right? So we have two projects on. One is on the childcare industry and one is on the elder care industry, where we are trying to place women in childcare jobs. And we have found that the lack of childcare support is coming in again, right, to actually create the same barrier as we saw in work. Anyway, so that's one thing. The other thing is that it's not so simple, because I know that the businesses are going to be like, well, if you make things so difficult for us, then there will be no business and then there will be no jobs. So I think that for the SMEs, it is important to also support them to also, pay their workers more. Because I know they're struggling, and there's a whole thing about the Singapore economy, the rents, the high rentals that we have to pay, etc. So it is quite an intractable problem, but I think we really need to solve it in some way. Yeah.
This leads me to another question, which is that with a lot of these employment and wage issues, they are sometimes framed almost as a zero-sum game. Even flexible work arrangements, more understanding approach towards family responsibilities and so on. They're sometimes framed as a zero-sum game, and all these things become considered almost as labor costs to the employer. I wanted to ask the panel, in particular Carrie, because of her private sector background, how does it benefit employers to treat their workers more fairly?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Kong Ho. I have diverse experiences to share. One was from my days as headhunting. What people don't realize, or sometimes businesses don't mindfully quantify, is that there is a huge cost to turnover, huge cost to rehiring, huge cost to retraining. So having people to stay on in their jobs for your business is actually a good thing. What we've seen on the ground from Daughters of Morals perspective and in our experience placing women with supportive employers is this exact benefit. We've seen how employers who were able to exercise a lot of empathy and support were able to retain their staff and have a very dedicated and very loyal workforce. One of our women, Fiza, she's a single mother of 6. There was a point in time that she didn't have enough money to get home from work. She walked 1.5 hours to get home. I don't know how you find a more hardworking person than that. And it's truly a blessing to her employer to have her on staff. So what her employer, which is Neo Social, a social enterprise, did was they made the shifts amenable to Fiza's timing. And in those days, on those days when she absolutely have no other recourse and her youngest child has nowhere to go, she allows Fiza to bring her kid to work, and the kid just sits in one of the chairs while mommy does the manicure for the customers and sticks an iPad. I'm not advocate of iPad or tablets for kids, but you don't have a choice. And the boy is there, he's not disruptive. Customers come in, oh, he's kind of cute, you know, and it works out. We have other employers who are able to rescope and restructure their original job scopes to cater for the women's abilities and timing, and they're able to retain better. And I think on a wider scale, I think we can draw from certain research and pilots that has been done by employers or large businesses overseas, one of which is commissioned by Gap, which is your clothing store in the US, and they got University of Chicago to do this study, which they then implemented, which was to implement core and stable scheduling in their shops. So the practice we see now is that most retail jobs, F&B or service line jobs, you have to roster. So you're there, whether you're a part-time staff or a full-time staff, you get rostered. You may have to do morning, afternoon, or evening shifts, all the same throughout the week, right? And it's almost impossible for women to structure their care or to structure the support or sources of care around such a perpetually changing cycle. So what Gap did was they implemented core and stable scheduling to provide more stable and regular hours for their staff. And over time, it translated to increased business revenue because staff are more motivated. They're able to give more of themselves and focus more at work because they know they have made the regular arrangements to get their kids taken care of. So even in terms of business sense, it makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
I think this question of what's in it for capital, what's in it for businesses, to pay attention to care is something that, again, has quite a long tradition in feminist scholarship. And earlier, feminist scholarship talked a lot about this idea of social reproduction. And the basic idea here is that for there to continue to be good workers and healthy workers in the economy, functioning as economic actors, that work of the reproduction of those workers is often happening in the domestic realm, in the form of caregiving paid to children who will be future workers, etc., or caregiving on people who are currently workers, right? The people who are currently workers have to go home, and somehow their meals have to be made, their beds have to be made, and etc., right? And that there is a lot of hidden labor that is actually necessary for the upkeep, essentially, of a continuous flow of workers into the economy. So there has historically in feminist scholarship been a lot of attention paid to social reproduction. And more recently, I think feminist economists are now trying to somehow account for some of these activities, to begin to calculate and begin to sort of quantify some of this activity that's happening in the domestic sphere, often in unpaid forms, often in informal forms, but that are actually important components of any functioning economy. I think it's an important sort of angle to pay attention to, that businesses, that capital requires workers, and that capital and businesses require the continuous rejuvenation, right, of new generations of workers who are educated, who are healthy, who are motivated to work, etc. And I think it's important to see also that part of this is tapping on a lot of private unpaid labor, and the unpaid labor primarily of women. But part of it also, of course, is tapping on public resources, because for businesses to do what they do, for capital to do what it does, of course, they rely on lots of public resources in the form of education of children, in the form of public infrastructures of care, in the form of health systems, right? And so, in fact, private businesses, what seem like private businesses, are actually tapping a huge amount on what are public resources. And I think that that's also an important sort of component to pay attention to. So that when we think about, corporations paying taxes, we shouldn't think of it as they are being punished, that taxes is a punishment. No, but corporations draw from public resources in order to run businesses. So it's not unreasonable that corporations pay back into the public resource, what they've taken from it.
Thank you very much. This reminds me of research also looking at Yuan's point about how the state is actually subsidizing a lot of this reproduction of labor. A big part of it is, of course, conditional social assistance that makes financial help conditional on finding work and so on. Some of the sharpest criticism of this approach says that that sort of social assistance, rather than creating jobs that people want, they are creating workers for jobs that nobody wants, right? So again, a very big reminder that so the social policy regime surrounding work itself has a very big part to play. Now to the issue of childcare, we heard in a presentation earlier on that compliance costs is a big issue. The lengths to which people need to go to access what schemes are available. I wanted to ask Siti, because of your experience at work, could you help us to understand, especially for the many young faces I see in the audience, what do people have to do in order to qualify for subsidized childcare? What sort of documents do people have to submit? How are they assessed? And so how difficult is it?
From my experience is that the basic subsidy, everybody knows about it. What people do not know is the additional subsidy that they can get. So from the school that I'm working at, actually some parents do not know. The center does not tell, or they just take it as they are not interested in getting the subsidy. The way that it is, the procedure is they just do the registration with the school, submit the request for the basic subsidy, which is keyed in by the principal into the system, ACDA system, and ACDA will inform us how much subsidy for working moms that they would be getting. Then after that, the additional subsidies, they have to submit supporting documents, without which we would not be able to give out the additional subsidy. Yeah. The documents that they actually need is documents from the company stating that they are working. They have to be Singaporean. They cannot be, foreigners will not be able to get. And if they do not, the ISC, I think. Hang on. Thinking. Yeah, that's basically it. The company's letter, very important, and they need to be Singaporean. I think that's it.
Thank you.
Oh, okay. Sorry, that one was about work. From my own experience to apply for additional subsidies, because of the school, earlier I said the school that my kids are schooling, they do not get any subsidies at all for the parents because they are only one outlet. If we were to, I did try to go through FSC officers to ask for help to get additional subsidies. We were not able to. They only advised us to go to a PCF or government government approved schools. Only then you can get the subsidies. If not, we are not able to.
A lot of the issue with the compliance seems to have to do with the way both childcare and early childhood education is organized, mainly the segregation into subsidized or almost public providers and completely corporate or private providers. The recommendation for free childcare for families earning less than 2005, I think may address some of the access issues if the assessment regime is made lighter and so on. But it seems there's also an issue to do with the persistent undersupply of subsidized places and the excess capacity of full charging centers. That seems to point to the direction, or it begs the question of why early childhood education and childcare needs to be a segregated system, quite unlike the rest of Singapore's education system. Do any of the panelists have thoughts about this? Yeah. Is it so the question is it time to nationalize early childhood education? Why should it be different from the rest of Singapore's education system?
Did you hear the audience? So there's a private sector and there's a public sector, right, in early childhood education, and I think that this is it is a very important point to consider whether this persistence of this segregation is whether if the end goal is greater equality among kids and for families, whether the persistence of a segregated sector, private versus public, will be a key barrier to the achievement of greater equality. And one way to think about it is to think about how when the private and public sector pays so differently, for example, there will always be a tapping of human talent from the public to the private sector. Yeah, so that teachers who are more experienced, have more years of work experience, perhaps who have more years of training, are very likely to be poached and taken into the private sector. And that this will likely, in the long run, mean that the kind of variations in quality of care will persist. And the different costs will also, of course, mean different kinds of student-teacher ratio or adult-child ratio. And with early childhood in particular, that is a huge difference. And as you'll have heard, I think quality of care is a very, very big issue on the part of parents. And, when parents feel that they cannot trust caregivers, particularly for children who are very young and unable to articulate their own complaints in a very clear and straightforward way, parents worry a great deal about their children in caregiving facilities. So the question of quality is a very, very important one, and evening out quality across the sector, I think, is a very urgent problem. So quality is important. I think we should also think about this question because childcare is, as I think all of you will know, not just about care, not just about, keeping children alive, right? It's about so much of it is about preparing kids for school. Yeah, and increasingly it's where one of the huge inequalities lie among young children is how prepared for primary one they are. Yeah, I think that there's a lot that needs to change in the primary part of things. Yeah, but without thinking about that change, it's clear that it's important for there to be greater equality and greater evenness in the kind of preparedness children have before they enter the formal school system. So I think that is also quite important. In the long run, since social mixing has been in the kind of national debate as well, so much about this issue we have with essentially us living in very separate societies depending on where in the class spectrum we lie. Yeah, I think that a lot of this is starting in the early childhood education sector or in childcare sector where there is this kind of divide, among kids coming from different family backgrounds. So if social mixing is a big goal, this could also be one of the areas where it could be tackled.
I want to respond to this because I think Kar Ho framed it as a question of whether childcare or preschool education should be nationalized. And I think it fits into our consideration as individuals living in a society of what do we believe in and stand for as individuals. Are we prepared to have less, but have enough so that other people can have a better chance? I think it's impossible to fault any parents for wanting the best for their kids and for the best for their children. And if there exists options in society that put your kids at a so-called better footing, we can't fault parents for opting for that. So, in my opinion, I feel that nationalizing is great because it will give everyone a more equitable footing. But I can also understand how difficult it could be from the point of a parent. And that begs, that fits into the larger narrative of us as a society, right? Must it always be a zero-sum game? What is this competition driving us into? Right, I give my kid the best, and then what? They get the best job, they earn the best money, and then what? I don't know. I mean, I grapple with that, right? So I just want to put that question out there for everyone to think about.
I think one of the things about where we are today is this private market has become just so unmanageable. And I think that's why the government has said we'll have 40,000 more childcare places because I think the government has lost control of this particular market. And they came in very late, right? ACTA was formed only a few years ago. So the direction is correct. We did look at some models, and France has a very good childcare system, I think. And actually that childcare is completely dependent on income. If you are a high income earner, and it's like percentage of your income. So people who are richer pay more. People who have less money, they pay less. but everyone gets the same quality. And this thing about all schools being good schools, that should be something that we also aspire to for childcare, right? That all childcare centers should be good childcare centers. At this point, I don't think the government has control, so we actually do need to do something about that first.
I want to also add, I think Carrie raises a really good point about this kind of how do we think as individuals about what we should be doing and what is right or wrong to do, right? As parents or as members of society. And I think that there are, that we are complex, we are each complex and capable of having multiple interests, yeah. And sometimes I think there's often a tendency for us to think in terms of our narrow short-term interests. But there are also long-term and broader interests we should keep in mind when we are making some of these decisions. I've said this line quite a few times, but at the risk of sounding repetitive, I'll say it again, that we will all grow old in societies populated by other people's children, that the well-being in some ways of other people's children is actually probably more important than just the well-being of your 1, 2, 3, however many children, yeah, because we don't live as isolated individuals, right? And we have shared well-being, what our society is going to look like, what the economy is going to look like, what our polity is going to look like, what our social norms will be, 10, 20, 30 years from now, actually also now, of course. It shapes our well-being. Our well-being is not shaped just by the relationships we have within the confines of our home. So I think we have lots of interest in other people's children, being healthy, being educated, having a sense of social responsibility, having a sense of belonging to this place.